Whether deliberately or subconsciously chosen, your language tells the audience who you are. A clever composer uses that fact to his advantage. Language is, after all, a human thing. It's used to convey a particular idea, to challenge societal views, or to promote a particular political agenda. When we're speaking about those ideas, views, or agendas, we choose a range of language features to help communicate our point, and those language features carry our own human imprint. They're affected by who we are, what kind of point we want to convey, and to whom we want to convey it. This is our distinctive voice. In Dr. King's 1963 speech, I Have a Dream, he uses a range of rhetorical devices to convey his theme, and we're going to look at what those are. I Have a Dream draws on the distinctive voice of Dr. King for its persuasive power. There are distinctive aspects of King represented, and each of those appeals to a different element of the population. By including all four, King's message is inclusive. It appeals to everybody. In this speech, we hear the voice of a preacher, a patriot, a realist, and an idealist. These aspects of King's perspective are highlighted through his choice of rhetorical devices. We'll explore the five most distinctive rhetorical devices used by King. They are anaphora, the repetition of key phrases at the beginning of successive sentences, repetition of a key theme word throughout the speech, quotations and allusions, specific examples to ground the arguments, and metaphors to highlight contrasting concepts. To begin with, let's look at anaphora. Anaphora is a repetition of words at the beginning of successive clauses or sentences. Repeating words twice sets up the pattern, then more times emphasizes the importance. The title of the speech refers to one of the most famous examples of rhetorical anaphora. I Have a Dream is repeated in 8 successive sentences and is a very striking feature. It tells King's story. This vision of the future is out of reach at the moment, but it would be wonderful and we should strive to make it a reality. This is an example of King the idealist. There are many other examples of anaphora in the speech. Look in the second paragraph. King repeats, 100 years later. But 100 years later, we must face the tragic fact that the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled, etc., etc. This time, King repeats the idea that much time has passed and the situation is still bad. This is King the realist. Of course, anaphora is not the only language device used here. You've probably spotted some others, but we'll return to those later. Some other examples of anaphora are, now is the time, in paragraph 4, we must, in paragraphs 6 and 7, we cannot or can never be satisfied, in paragraph 7. These examples of anaphora all emphasize the immediacy of the situation. They use high modality language like must and now and never to demand action. Go back in paragraph 9 and let freedom ring in paragraphs 21 and 27 are examples that use the imperative. They give instructions. Again, the emphasis is on people taking action. The bell metaphor is a reference to the Liberty Bell, a symbol of American freedom from the Revolutionary War. Here is King the patriot. In paragraph 18, with this faith, is an example of anaphora. It's King the preacher. So you can see that King's use of anaphora emphasizes his theme, that the present situation is bad and we need to change it right now. And it appeals to lots of people in the audience through his roles as a patriot, a preacher, a realist, and an idealist. Whereas anaphora repeats words or phrases in close proximity, or in groups if you will, the repetition of key words occurs throughout the speech. The words become more significant and more memorable because of the repetition. By collecting up the often repeated words, you can figure out the main themes of the speech. Dr. King uses repetition a lot. Freedom is the most common, with 20 repetitions, because it's the main theme of the speech. Not only are the Negro people unable to exercise their freedom at the moment, the prejudiced ways of thinking also mean that the dominant white culture is unfree. We mentioned earlier that Dr. King is inclusive in his message. He repeats we 30 times, our 17 times, and the plural form of you 18 times. Here he emphasizes collective responsibility. He's not just talking to both groups, the white and the Negro. He's talking to everybody as one group. Dr. King the Patriot appears in his use of nation 10 times, America 5 times, and American 4 times. Patriotism is a powerful persuasive force, especially in the 1960s when America was under threat from the Cold War and they were fighting a hot war in Southeast Asia. Even white supremacists understood patriotism as a motivation. Justice is also an important theme in this speech. Justice for the Negro people and the righteousness of being just for the dominant culture. We shouldn't answer the call to action just because it's convenient or because it's economically useful, but because it's the right and just thing to do. We also discussed dream earlier. It's repeated 11 times throughout the speech. This is Dr. King, the idealist. Referencing events or texts that your audience already knows is a powerful and efficient way of emphasizing the credibility of your argument. When you do this explicitly by using the words directly, it's a quotation. When it's implicit, using your own words but referring to the known event or text, it's an allusion. The power of the quotation or allusion depends on the already accepted credibility of the source. Dr. King uses this technique many times, primarily in his roles as patriot and preacher. As we look through them, you might draw this table. Pause the video while you rule it up. 50 years ago, in the very opening, refers to Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, which began 77 years ago. The speech is very well known by anyone who's been through an American elementary school, and the allusion is particularly poignant because Dr. King was speaking in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Abraham Lincoln was the president who officially abolished slavery in America. It was a dangerous and unpopular move at the time, and it, among other things, led to the American Civil War and eventually Lincoln's own assassination. Even though a lot of people disapproved, Lincoln argued that slavery was inconsistent with the American Constitution as well as being morally wrong. Here, Dr. King refers to the long tradition of American values, which include a legislative emphasis on freedom. This is King the Patriot. In paragraph 3, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and indeed the rest of the paragraph, is a direct reference to the United States Declaration of Independence. The quotation reminds the listener of their nationalistic pride in America and its traditions. It defines freedom as an officially sanctioned legal concept. You'll also notice in this paragraph that Dr. King refers to architects and banks, groups which are representative of legitimate or official authority. The banking reference also gives a hint of King the realist, but I want to come back to that later. Towards the end of the speech, Dr. King quotes from the patriotic song "My Country 'Tis of Thee," also known as America. This song was one of the unofficial national anthems used by Americans before 1931 when Star-Spangled Banner was adopted. Many of Dr. King's listeners would have been alive before the 1930s, and they would have sung that song with great passion. In this quotation, Dr. King includes both black and white listeners, all God's children. He assumes that patriotism is good and powerful, and he suggests that it's also inclusive. Still dealing with quotations and allusions, we come to King the Preacher. There are lots of religious allusions in the speech, so I'm only going to cover a few in detail. The preponderance of these religious allusions reminds us that Dr. King is not just an activist and a civil rights campaigner. He's a pastor, a Protestant priest. As such, he carries moral authority and commands extra respect. Through all of these allusions, Dr. King presents a moral basis for his arguments. In the opening paragraph, "It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity," alludes to Psalms 35. "For his anger is but a moment, his favour is for a lifetime. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning." In paragraph 4, "Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood," is a reference to Christ's parable of the wise man who builds on the rock and the fool who builds on sand in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. In paragraph 6, "Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred," evokes Jeremiah chapter 2:13. "For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and dug out cisterns for themselves, cracked cisterns that can hold no water. And in the final paragraph, Dr. King says, "And when this happens, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the Negro spiritual," etc., etc. This is an allusion to Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." Each of these religious allusions establishes Christian biblical authority for Dr. King's overarching message of freedom and equality. You'll notice that Dr. King doesn't quote, but rather alludes to the biblical stories. Even if you didn't know the references, the metaphors would still make sense. In this way, Dr. King conveys his moral authority without sounding like the Bible-bashing, hellfire and brimstone preacher of the popular stereotype. Dr. King gives a lot of theoretical, logical arguments to support his central theme. He refers to patriotism, Christianity, justice, freedom. These are all lofty and important concepts, but there's a danger that they'll seem too conceptual or diaphanous unless they're grounded in real examples. Dr. King therefore gives a range of references to real examples, especially geographical references, to make his case seem concrete and really important. In the middle section of the speech, he references particular states which carry connotations for the listeners. Mississippi is in the deep South, where lynchings were common and prejudice ruled. It was a scene of race riots in the 1950s and 60s after the US government outlawed racial segregation. Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana are also southern states with a history of racial conflicts. The trial of Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird was based on a real case from Alabama, in which 9 black teenagers were unjustly convicted of raping a white girl by a prejudiced, entirely white jury. If you haven't read that book, you should, by the way, or at least watch the movie. New Hampshire, New York, and Pennsylvania are older, northern states through which the Underground Railway ran in the late 1800s and the early 20th century. While black people were technically free there much earlier, they were never really considered equals. These states are known even today for their predominantly WASP populations. New York is a site of Harlem and the South Bronx, infamous ghettos. Colorado and California also rate a mention. Being western states, they're associated with the wildness and opportunity of a new land, but also the exploitation of labour to make it work. Notice in the final climax of his speech, Dr. King employs polysyndeton, a sense of multiplicity which draws on the repetition of different versions of the same thing. In this case, it's the repetition of mountains in various states, in increasing order of the transformation required for justice to reign there. New York, Pennsylvania, Colorado, California, Georgia, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Here Dr. King builds through anaphora to a climax, emphasizing the real challenges, that is, the mountains, and the real possibilities of freedom, inclusivity, and justice. Using a metaphor helps people understand a theoretical concept by associating it with a concrete image which evokes a particular emotion. Dr. King does this often to elucidate his theme. There are 3 kinds of metaphors that we'll explore here. Antithetical metaphors, where there are 2 sides to the image, each contrasting with the other. Allusion metaphors, which create a double meaning relying on your knowing another story. And extended metaphors, where the same image is drawn out and developed over several sentences or paragraphs. Antithetical metaphors are when you have 2 contrasting concepts which show the transformation or the distance between what is and what could or should be. In paragraph 2, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity, compares the size of an island with the size of an ocean, emphasizing the isolation of the Negro who lives in poverty, as well as the disparity in income and living conditions. In paragraph 5, this sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there's an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality, uses inverted seasonal imagery to compare the suffering of Negro people at the moment with the possibility of freedom that King raises. Usually summer imagery refers to sweet, fertile, sunny times when we're relaxed and enjoying the beauty of nature, but here it becomes harsh, not unlike the burning, unpleasant summer of Mississippi. We discussed the associations of Mississippi earlier. Autumn, then, instead of representing death and the fading of beauty, becomes a time of relief and invigoration. The climate that King refers to here is more like the one we know as the Australian summer, or a Caribbean one. It refers to the place where Negro people used to be held and traded as slaves. The Summer of Discontent also is an allusion to Shakespeare's play Richard III, in which Richard gives the statement that now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. He's talking about a time when we've previously been upset, and that was horrible in winter. But now this son of York, or this new king, has come to the throne and is going to make everything okay. Richard is actually being quite ironic there, but that's not the point of the story. Returning to the metaphors and building on that heat imagery that we saw in the previous one, in paragraph 14, Dr. King refers to Mississippi, a desert state sweltering with the heat of injustice and oppression, which will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. Here, all that's unpleasant and oppressive about heat is compared with the relief of shade and water. In a slightly different version, in paragraph 18 is this: transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Discord means both disagreement or tension and, more literally, two chords on an instrument which clash with each other, creating an unpleasant sound. A beautiful symphony is difficult to produce. It takes time and effort, careful balance, and a lot of creativity, but the output is worth it because of the sublime transporting result. The two are the opposite, thetical of the idea. The two things represent other ideas, so they're metaphors. An antithetical metaphor. Allusion metaphors have their greatest impact when you already understand something else, though they still work even if you don't. Whereas before we saw the idealistic Dr. King talking about what could or should be, now we see Dr. King the preacher using religious references to give nuance to his argument. In the opening paragraph, it came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity, was mentioned before. It's a reference to Psalms. In this case, you can understand the new possibility of mourning against one of those nights when you can't sleep and it just seems unpleasantly to drag on forever. Likewise, the whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges, is also a biblical allusion. It refers to the fall of Jericho, a city which was under siege and whose walls only fell at the blast of a trumpet, which literally shook their foundations because of the power of the sound. To shake the foundations of something has become a modern idiom as well, so you don't really need to understand the story of Jericho to understand the metaphor, but it adds an extra layer if you do. In paragraph 4, this is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, refers to the mostly Protestant but recently generalized idea that luxury is indulgent and immoral. Likewise, we have an idea of drug taking as not only very dangerous to your health, which it is by the way, and if you do it you should stop, but also immoral and wrong, and hence illegal. In this case, going slowly would be nice and certainly more comfortable, but it's also self-indulgent and immoral to leave people suffering when your speedy action could relieve them. The dominant extended metaphor in this speech is the one about banks, checks, and business. Here is Dr. King the realist. The metaphor draws on imagery about banks, traditionally the institutions which controlled money and were trustworthy. It used to be that if you had to go to court, you could get a character reference from a preacher or a bank manager, and they would be treated roughly the same. The promissory note was basically an old-fashioned Visa card. To speak simplistically, in American society, having money made you good. So passing a bad check, that is trying to get the bank to pay out money from your account when you don't actually have money in your account, was immoral and it pointed to bad character. Being declared bankrupt meant you had no money at all and no chance of getting any money by your present means, and that meant you were highly morally suspect. Indeed, it still kind of carries that connotation. During the Great Depression, there were arguments that went along the line that people who were destitute should not get any help because they must have done something to deserve the dreadful situation in which they found themselves. Perhaps they were lazy or a drunkard or something like that, Lack of money meant lack of moral authority. Having money meant respectability. Dr. King refers to the financial situation that most Negroes experienced at the time. He acknowledges the reality that money, authority, and power go together and can only be accessed in a situation of economic equality. There are two aspects here. The Negroes have been defrauded. They're the victims, not the perpetrator. They were promised something and the other treacherous party didn't come through. And the other side is that Negro people want and deserve economic equality, equal pay, equal opportunity, etc. Acknowledging the reality of the present situation shows the listener that Dr. King is not just this high-minded guy lecturing from a big pulpit. He's actually connected with real life. This is Dr. King the realist. So, to review, we've seen that there are four aspects of Dr. King's distinctive voice: the preacher, the patriot, the realist, and the idealist. He reveals these four aspects of his perspective when he uses a range of rhetorical devices to convey his theme, including anaphora, repetition, allusion, real examples, and metaphors. Dr. King is inclusive in his message. His four aspects appeal to broad sections of the population, and his continual use of inclusive language like we and our backs that up. Because of his command of oratory and his inclusive message, Dr. King presents a powerfully persuasive and hugely influential speech. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments section or bring them to class.